So, good afternoon, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Unlocking AI's Role in Fraud and Financial Crime. For way of a short introduction, I am Alan Patterson and the CEO at Plenitude. We specialise in financial crime and fraud prevention, and in addition to our technology, AI and data services, provide market-leading advisory, transformation and KYC managed services. To set the scene for today's webinar, AI, as you are no doubt aware, has become a top priority for firms, and this is driven largely by the increasing cost of compliance and the transformative opportunities unlocked by AI, which of course present a number of compelling benefits in terms of increased operational efficiency, optimization, and more effective risk management. However, with that, AI has also introduced a new set of challenges for firms in the context of evolving regulations, and where understanding how decisions are made is crucial to ensure that FCA expectations are met, alongside the more onerous requirements of the recently published European AI Act. So the purpose of today's webinar is to provide some insights from our panel of experts who are playing a lead role in the financial crime and fraud space, where we will talk about the adoption of AI and the impact on financial crime and fraud, current AI regulation and guidance in Europe and the UK, and some of the practical implications for firms and AI solution providers. And in the context of those evolving regulatory requirements and expectations, the challenges of explainability and conformity assessments in AI systems and models. And lastly, we'll touch on some best practices for implementing robust AI governance. Joining me on the webinar, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Janet Basterman, who is the Chief Data Scientist at Napier AI and also the Chair of the Royal Statistical Society Data Science and AI section. Napier AI is a world-leading provider of AI-enhanced financial crime technology software. Also joining us is Professor Karsten Maple, who is Professor of Cyber System Engineering at the University of Warwick and Director for Research Innovation at the National Hub for Edge AI, and he's also a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. The Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. I'm also delighted to welcome Professor Lukas Spruch, who is the Programme Director for Finance and Economics at the Alan Turing Institute and Professor of Mathematics at the University of Edinburgh. And last but not least, we have Munir Merchant, who is the head of Plenitude's Technology and Data Practice. He has over 20 years industry experience within financial services and technology consulting. Some very quick housekeeping points before we kick off. The session will be recorded, and we will send out a link to all of those people that have registered and on the call today, and it will also be available on our website. If you do have any questions, then please pop them in the Q&A box throughout the session. We do have some time earmarked at the end of the webinar to address questions. No promises that we'll cover them all. And if you have any questions that you don't want to send through chat, then please feel free to email us at inquiries@plenitudeconsulting.com. So I'd like to start with discussing adoption of AI in terms of managing financial crime and fraud. So Janet, in your role as Chief Data Scientist at Napier, how are you seeing the adoption of AI play out with your clients in terms of managing financial crime risk, and what are the typical use cases?
Thank you. I think you touched on a few of them in your opening introduction, that we are still seeing quite a wide variation in adoption, despite it being a strategic initiative for many companies. And this can be based on a whole host of things. So starting on maybe the individual institution's readiness, you can't just plug in AI and magically get results. You need to have good data, and you need to really understand what you're looking for in order to apply it to its best case, so you can apply the right sort of models or make sure that you've got the right information to train in the first place. We're also seeing some sticking points around sort of internal data risk governance processes. So where you have data siloed within a business, bringing that all together can sometimes be a challenge before that adoption can start. And then with the changing regulations, there's a bit of reticence to be the first there, just in case they get it wrong, alongside either that perceived approval or lack of approval from the appropriate regulators. But that said, we're still seeing a lot of want to adopt AI, but there really is a journey that needs to be gone on, either to get that use case or the data in the right state early on. But there are some companies that are getting this right, and they're seeing that it's adding information, it's adding insights, and it's enabling them to be more efficient and more comprehensive in their approach rather than just for budgetary reasons, which is quite interesting. Many of them start off with that financial incentive to cut some costs and be more efficient, but they're actually seeing the insights that AI gives them to be a bit broader. In terms of use cases, I mean, there are many. The one that's particularly close to my heart is transaction monitoring. This has been something that's been heavily dominated by rules for such a long time. But when you look at the financial crime typologies, they're quite broad, they can be vague in places, and having something that's very prescriptive about time periods or amounts just doesn't work. And AI is great at looking at vast amounts of data and spotting patterns and variations in patterns, changing behaviors, things like that, that it's a practical impossibility for a rules-based system or even a whole room full of humans to look at, just because you can't look across all of that data at once. And you really need the fuzziness that AI can provide in order to progress that.
Thank you. Moving on to you, Munir, in your role as Head of Tech and Data at Plenitude, can you share where you're seeing the most use cases in terms of adoption of AI?
Yeah, so I think overall I agree with Janet in that over the past couple of years, or maybe past 2 or 3 years, there's been a want. There've been a number of use cases that have been discussed. Some have been in the proof of concept stage. Some have been taken further. In terms of what I've seen recently in the area of screening, so transaction screening, real-time transaction screening, and name list screening across large databases of politically exposed persons and adverse media lists. There have been a couple of use cases that I've been close to that have actually been implemented, are live in some institutions and are demonstrating benefits. So I think the first one is around using AI-powered matching engines. So along the lines of what Janet said, in the transaction monitoring world, in the screening world, traditional screening engines or technologies have been heavily rules-based, which have their limitations, and then they come with the overhead that a firm needs to continually maintain and update a rule set in order to be effective. But I think on the back of some POCs that I've seen and a few live implementations, I think we're at the stage now where it is sort of proven that when some of these AI powered technologies are calibrated and deployed appropriately, the level of risk coverage that one gets is way higher. There have been comparisons done as well when compared to rules-based systems, and at the point beyond that, which is at the operation stage, again, in screening, when it comes to real-time sanction screening and name screening, again, there have been a few use cases where AI-powered entity resolution engines have been successfully doing the level 1 alert clearing job that normally can prove to be quite costly for banks. So yeah, I think these would be the two sort of main live use cases that I've seen recently.
Okay, no, thank you, Munir. Lukash, I understand that you're working on some innovative AI projects in the fraud space. Could you talk us through some of the work that you're undertaking at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Alan. So there's a number of projects that we do in that space, but one I want to talk about is around synthetic data generation. So this is an idea of using computer algorithms to produce data, representative data sets for particular challenges. And we do that in combination with also data augmentation. If you're interested, there is a paper that we co-authored with Karsten and a few other colleagues at the Turing, commissioned by the Royal Society, Synthetic Data, What, Why, and How. fairly comprehensive review. But there is a number of reasons we are working on this. So Janet has mentioned word data, I don't know, at least 10 times in that short presentation. And data is absolutely fundamental to all AI and machine learning applications. You know, they're only as good as the data that you have to train those models. But the data is also a big bottleneck. So the first, especially financial crime data sits within financial crime departments within the banks. It's very private. It's very difficult to share it even within organizations. So we work with some leading UK banks, for example, to allow them to produce representative copies of that private data, so that internally they can use it for running hackathons and to be able to tap on data talent within the organization, not to mention sharing outside that organization, for example, with research institutes. Similarly, there is a lot of crime that is happening not only using one particular financial institution, by the network of various financial entities. And for, again, privacy reasons, they cannot share that data. There is also a big challenge in that whenever we are developing a new algorithms for detecting crime or flagging up some suspicious transactions, the moment you develop a new algorithm for doing that, the criminals immediately will realize that, that what the fraud they're trying or crime they're trying to commit is being now investigated. So necessarily they're going to change some ways they're doing this, which means that the algorithms that you're training, the data that you're using to train those algorithms necessarily will be different from the data that you will be deploying those newly developed technology. And by using synthetic data, what you can do in principle is you are able to, if you are able to anticipate what kind of changes of behaviors of this criminal activity may be, you can try to generate the data, go beyond what's your historical data, and be able to develop better, more effective solutions. So number of applications, and we have a whole kind of array of projects in that space.
Thank you, Lukasz. And Carsten, would you mind just quickly talking through some of the work that you're doing within the sort of financial crime space as well?
Yeah, of course. So thanks very much, Alan. And Lukasz has mentioned some. So we've got this major work in the framework for responsible AI in finance. But I think what I'd like to add before going into a bit more of that is some of my work is around security and privacy. So I sit on the Royal Society Working Group for Privacy Enhancing Technologies. So I'm looking at how can we do things securely and privately. And that work that Lukasz mentioned from the Royal Society and Alan Turing Institute, the work that we co-authored, was part of this Privacy Enhancing Technologies Working Group. So what we're looking at is how can we securely and privately share data, as Lukasz said, sometimes within organization or beyond, give it to a third party or another bank. But there are a range of different techniques, and synthetic data is one that Lukasz mentioned, and that the Financial Conduct Authority, in fact, we had an event yesterday, Janet, myself and Lukasz were there, and a bunch of others, where we're looking at the synthetic data expert group to see what's the role of this in managing risk, including use cases of financial crime. So we've been looking at those, but one thing that I think that's important is synthetic data is one way to do that. Another way is to use some other privacy enhancing technologies, such as secure multi-party computation or homomorphic encryption. Now, I won't go into the technical details, but then hopefully the viewers can have a little look what they are. But essentially, it means how can I operate on encrypted data? So therefore, if I send information to somebody else in the organization or somebody across a border, can they get some learning out of that data without understanding the data itself? Can we have some shared intelligence? And that can really help about solving some financial crimes. It can help us where you can't send account information across a border, for example, but you might want to say, is there an account that's got a similar name or similar characteristics? And we've got these new techniques that we've developed that are being looked to be patented. So that's one thing I think that's important. But going back to Lukasz's point about viewing what's future issues might arise. That thing from the security background I have about red teaming, it's really trying to probe and understand how might someone try to undermine your AI technique. And let's say the AI technique was to determine whether a transaction was fraudulent or not. What we can do is that's based upon many data points. And what we can do is when the decision is we will flag this as fraud or we won't, what was distinctive? What is what we call counterfactual? If I change one single element in the data, would it have been, rather than flagged, it was unflagged? Or if we learn afterwards that we didn't detect it, that all of a sudden we say, if we'd have just spotted this, it would have been flagged if this was different. And that helps us understand the boundary a lot better and helps us make a lot better decisions. And synthetic data is going to be really important for that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And clearly there's some really innovative work going on at the moment in the financial crime and fraud space. I think the thing for me is if you look at, a number of different reports, the adoption rates vary widely, from 40% of firms have adopted AI to as high as 90%. What's the sort of panel's view on that, and where are you seeing the sort of the main demand at the moment from an AI perspective?
I think if I can give my view on that, Alan, I think in the financial crime compliance space, in terms of the maximum demand that I'm seeing are basically the use cases that result in a direct operational cost saving, the benefit. So I think those are the ones we're finding that demonstrate return on investment more easily. But yeah, I'm sure there are others that are at a proof of concept or earlier stages of adoption as well.
Yeah. And Janet, just in terms of the work that you do, is there demand from particular sectors? Are you seeing it across the board? What's the sort of typical profile?
Pretty much across the board. I think everyone's quite excited about it. And, as we've touched on initially, from a cost savings point of view, everyone wants to drive that efficiency. But then once they've started using it and they've got that first project live, it can then open up ideas for other ways in which it can benefit the business. And there can be lots of sort of adjunct internal projects that they can suddenly see value from that maybe they hadn't even considered as a target until they start using it. So it definitely opens up a lot of possibilities once you've got that first step. But at the risk of saying the word data once every 10 seconds, I mean, that's the critical thing. If you're not ready to start, then you need to look for other opportunities, whether it's the synthetic approach, as Lukash and Carsten have mentioned, or really getting your own house in order and being ready to apply these tools.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to AI regulation and guidance. As you might be aware, on the 6th of February this year, the UK government issued its AI guidance paper, which outlined the recommended approach for UK regulators to interpret and apply what is referred to as the 5 pro-innovation regulatory principles. In response to this, on the 22nd of April, the Financial Conduct Authority released their AI update. And in the update, the FCA set out how its existing regulatory framework maps to each of the 5 regulatory principles. They confirmed that along with the PRA, they will take the lead on regulating the use of AI in the financial sector, but restated its role as a technology agnostic, principles-based and outcomes-focused regulator, and that it's not a regulator of technology. And then more recently, on the 1st of August, the European AI Act entered into force, which defines how firms may develop, deploy or utilise various AI systems with the appropriate risk measures in place. So Carsten, what's your thoughts on the UK government and FCA's approach to AI regulation? Could you talk us through these 5 pro-innovation regulatory principles, and how do you see the regulatory framework evolving?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. I think it was a really interesting approach. And I think just generally, just to say that regulation can, but doesn't have to, stifle innovation. Actually, regulation sometimes can give the direction that one should go in. So what the government set out after many, messages saying they were not going to regulate, came out with this pro-innovation regulation kind of principles. So the first thing they said, is we've got to think about safety, security, and robustness, and this is all about making sure there's trust in this kind of system. But one of the words I want to pick up on is this safety, and it's really to say for the domains, and this was what was interesting. It said we're going to give you some principles, but you must do it for your sector. And I'll talk about the FCA response to that sector in a moment. But the first thing is you've got to define what does safety, or rather, what does unsafe mean? What are the harms? And that you've got to think about the context, because there are different harms in finance to what there are in other areas. So the FCA has to consider, like others, about how you define that safety, how you provide risk assessment tools, and how do you have informed decisions around this. They were trying to, the government was trying to say, look, try to think for your area based upon those harms. How often should AI systems be tested? How do we manage that robustness? And let me just tell you, these areas are not simple to do. It's ongoing research, and we're looking at the Turing and at Warwick and Edinburgh to do more to help the community in this space. The second aspect was around transparency and explainability. And this is important, right? Because especially in our finance sense, if you are, deemed a credit risk, or you're denied a loan, or you get some kind of loan rate based upon some algorithm, then that needs to be explainable in a sense, and transparent. And how much that's explained, is for the regulator maybe to guide, but for the organization to decide, because if you give too much away, you could be enabling fraud, right? And that's going to actually have a knock-on harm to your consumers, and the consumer duty aspect of FCA is what a lot of their answer was around. You need to make sure that it's fair, that some people aren't harmed disproportionately. And this is obvious, that what you want to make sure is it's equitable. There needs to be accountability and governance, and this term governance is a big challenge. It's a big thing, but really important around AI. And the final piece that they said of their principles was contestability and redress. And this is really important. So the BSI, the British Standards Institute, has recently done some work. I was part of their working group to look at what are the issues around contestability. And the reason is that the BSI thought we were quite good on the first four, but the fifth one was where we're lacking. I think it's quite right. So how do you contest a decision? What's the way, so if I want to appeal, how do I do that? So the FCA, very briefly, because I haven't got much time, has really said, look, we've got our consumer duty regime, and that's one of the main mechanisms that will address these. As you said, they're not going to regulate technology, but they are going to try and guide and work around how they support AI regulation in the space.
And they also pointed to the senior manager regime as well, but I think there's an acknowledgement that will need to evolve over time. No, thank you very much for that, Carsten. So Lukasz, what's your thoughts on the recently published European AI Act, and could you, at a high level, just talk us through the main requirements, including the need for a conformity assessment for high-risk systems, which I think would actually cover many of the systems that are used in a sort of financial crime compliance context, certainly from a decisioning and risk scoring perspective.
So this is a major milestone, many years in making. So AI EU Act is industry agnostic, and there are various approaches across the globe. It's output-based, principle-based. Europe decided to go for the risk-based approach. So the key idea is to evaluate AI systems based on the potential harm they might cause, and they classify then those risks into 4 categories. So unacceptable risks, such as social scoring, that's not allowed. There is a high risk, and that's mainly what would then apply in the context of financial services industry. There is a limited risk and the minimal risks. And And so what AI Act requires organizations to have appropriate governance, model, and data risk management systems in place. I just want to talk about some twists. And the interesting thing is that, of course, to some extent, financial services industry has a history of using complicated, complex models and data. So therefore, that some of those governance structures and model risk management frameworks are in place. For example, post 2018 financial crisis, the famous SR 11.7 that has been released by Fed in the US, that is kind of a standard, golden standard. However, AI brings up new challenges that some of those model risk management principles need to change. This is actually very active research area as we speak. Within a couple of years, there is AI model risk management framework that has been developed by NIST. So this is a National Institute for Standards and Technology in the US. Again, everyone is looking at this. Everyone is trying to understand how those model risk management practices map to the current practices they have within an organization. It's worth stressing that this is at the moment. There are principles how to do this model risk management, but we're still working really hard, and including the work that we're doing with Carsten at the Turing Institute, how we actually can operationalize those frameworks in practice. What are the right metrics? What are the right tools to be able to conform to some of the ideas that have been developed? And just to flag a couple of challenges. So one is around data. Again, data being fundamental to those machine learning AI systems. And previously, with a simpler models, you could have data assessment. You could test whether your data is not biased and private and those kind of fair. When using AI systems, that kind of assessment and validation and governance of the data will depend on the use case they're using data for. So it might be that you have two completely different applications using or two different models for different applications trained on the same data set. And for one of those applications, your data might be just fine, but for the other application, it might contain lots of biases, and you need to correct for that and pay attention. So that's one thing. So that means that you no longer can just tick the box around your data once and be happy. You really need every single new application, every single new model that you're training. You need to pay attention to data. There is a whole idea about evaluating and monitoring your models. And again, when we were using simpler rule-based models or systems, those models were much easier to manage. The parameters have clear interpretations. There was relatively well-developed practices how to stress test those models and understand when they may fail. For this more complicated, especially black box solutions, that's no longer the case. The parameters are meaningless. Various sensitivity analysis out of the window. So we need to think about new ways of validating and testing those models. And many of those techniques are empirical, which means that we cannot give 100% certifications, 100% guarantees for the model performance. We can give, at best, we can say that with high probability or within the kind of the test that we've performed, we believe that the system conforms, but it's impossible to exhaust all possible data scenarios that the model might be used for. So that's kind of important thing to keep in mind.
I think we'll talk a bit more about explainability frameworks and I suppose some of the challenges around validating these AI models.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So many new challenges. Just one point I want to mention. I was yesterday attending the meeting organized by World Economic Forum on the same issue, bringing across financial services industry, telecom, and others. And there is actually interesting opportunity about this regulation. So because there is still an uncertainty around how we operationalize various frameworks that are being put forward, organizations that are deploying AI, they effectively self-regulate, and that creates also opportunity to demonstrate to the regulators what actually works, how this regulation should be done in such a way that you don't stifle innovation. At the same time, you make sure that your systems are safe. So it's interesting moment in time, and it's really worth investing in those kind of self-assessment, self-regulation principles.
Absolutely. No, thank you very much for that, Lukasz. So Janet, in light of these evolving AI regulations and guidance, what do you see as the main practical implications for firms?
I think there's two parts to this, and it depends on whether firms are developing solutions in-house or using a third-party provider such as Napier to provide those models for them. You've really got to understand what the model is doing at a high enough level that you can justify it. And I know that sounds a little bit hand-wavy, but when you're looking at how we validate these systems, the validation that me and Carsten and Lukasz would do when we're looking at the model mathematically is very different from the processes that say an end user trying to make a decision whether to agree or disagree with a model would need. So you've got to have the right level of understanding of the models for the person that's assessing it. And I think that's where what Lukasz was saying about those sort of assessment and internal governance processes come in, is that within your company, there needs to be people that can understand it at all those different levels so that it can be explained and audited at the right levels. And that's key, whether it's something you're building in-house or whether you're something you're asking of someone else. And if it's a third party, they should be able to provide you with all of this information, starting with, sort of what data was it trained on to tick that box of, have you done the statistical analysis on how biased the data is, whether you've got enough coverage, things like that. So some sort of sensitivity analysis. We talked earlier about counterfactuals and understanding sort of where the model was sensitive to different changes so that you could be confident in what scenarios it may or may not perform well. Yeah. And then, all the way through to in-process explainability, whatever that means. And I know we're probably going to touch on that in more detail a bit later, but that as a key, absolutely fundamental. And I know a lot of the regulation talks about sort of the high-risk situations having humans in the loop. I prefer to have it the other way around and have AI in the loop of a well-defined process. So particularly with some of these riskier scenarios, and again, going back to sort of transaction monitoring, money laundering situations that are close to my heart, the profiles of some of the most vulnerable in society overlap very, very heavily with people who are actively money laundering. So if you have fully automated systems that we know are not 100% precise, then you need to be sure what mechanisms do you have in place to prevent that harm, which could be quite a large risk. So really understanding that. And what we're seeing with the regulations is they are currently very different worldwide, but they are starting to take bits from each other's as they're saying what's worked. So what we're looking at with sort of worldwide regulations is where is it the harshest and what does that mean? And where is it relaxing, and are they moving towards more relaxed or tighter controls, so that we're trying to see where things are going. And generally you do get a bit of runway. I mean, the EU AI Act, just like most of the EU acts, you've had a couple of years of talking about it. So also having someone in your company that's keeping an eye on what's being proposed, because if you need to make software changes, whether that's me and my capacity as sort of an AI sort of software vendor or in-house, you need to be aware of what's coming up so that you can make the necessary changes so that, let's say, your models output the necessary audit documents or can provide the right level of explainability or whatever else is coming out. So that's really key to keep an eye on the future roadmap.
Okay, thank you. And Minia, what's your perspective in terms of some of the impacts and implications?
Yeah, so I think overall, whilst we're aware that there are tangible benefits in deploying AI-based technologies in various areas of financial crime compliance, I think practically what I have seen is that both across the change cycle when you're deploying or implementing such a technology, and across the BAU cycle, there are some impacts and implications that are being seen. So I think the first thing, as Janet already touched upon, if you want to get the best out of an AI engine, whether it is in the area of transaction monitoring or screening or customer due diligence or risk rating, you need to understand the underlying data. And this is quite different from when we would implement rules-based systems, because they had a different approach. The whole methodology that a firm was sort of geared around was quite different. AI technologies would function. I mean, their performance has a direct correlation with the way the data is sort of mapped to it. So I think having an understanding of the financial crime data landscape and mapping that appropriately to sort of AI engines in order to tune them and calibrate them. I think that's the first sort of area of impact, in the sense that firms are looking to adapt or change their methodologies when it comes to tuning. So I think that's something that I'm seeing increasingly. And I think the benefits of getting that right means that you can realize the true potential of the AI sort of screening engine or transaction monitoring engine that you're looking to implement. The second one is around the approach for testing, as Janet already sort of indicated. Rules-based systems, when they are being implemented or on an ongoing basis during BAU, would be tested in a certain way. And I think the approach to testing AI-based engines is completely different. We heard earlier about the fact that you cannot prove with 100% certainty, as you could in the case of a rules-based environment, that this is the reason for that, and so on. But so you need to work on a probabilistic basis, and you need to have your test approach that works on that kind of basis as well. And then finally, the third practical implication comes once these technologies are implemented and you're in a cycle of regular periodic testing or assessments or investigations by monitors, auditors, and so on. Unfortunately, what I have seen at least is that it's quite difficult to explain to regulators why certain results have been produced or not been produced by AI engines, because previously with rules-based systems, it was probably a bit easier to do that. But it doesn't mean it's not possible to be done when you're using underlying AI engines. It just means that the methodology and the approach towards ongoing validation and testing needs to be sort of considered as well when you're looking to roll out such systems.
Good, thank you, Munir. So we've spoken about regulatory expectations, and we've also touched on the need for fairness, transparency to avoid bias. In practical terms, Lukasz, how do you develop an explainability framework, and how do you give transparency on the underlying AI model or system and provide assurance that ultimately the expected output is what's expected?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's very challenging indeed. So let me just take a step back first. We could spend pretty much this whole webinar just talking about what explainability means, and I had the pleasure to attend some of the workshops like that in the past. But if we take a step back and think again, like a contrastive analysis with a simpler models, rule-based and things like that, the way those models have been developed in the past, you would look at the data, you will analyze the data, you will bring some experts' knowledge, you will form certain hypotheses, and then based on those hypotheses, you will then construct the model or rules that would translate the data into decision. And so you not only at the end of that, you had a model on the algorithm for doing something, but you had a whole process of how you arrive at that algorithm. And that means that you were able to, at every point in time, in principle, evaluate, are my hypotheses still correct? And then is my model as corresponds to the hypothesis that I form. As we are moving now to AI systems, we are kind of doing this two steps simultaneously. So you just throw in the data, you make various opaque modeling assumptions, and you're producing the output. As a result of that, you lose that kind of explainability piece. You don't quite know how the output has been generated from the input data. And so what we are doing, we're trying to just reverse engineer now, say, okay, we took this great shortcut, we didn't have to put all that hard work thinking about analyzing data and bringing expert knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are various techniques that have been developed over the last 10 years to kind of unpack a little bit these black box models. But all of those techniques are just an approximation to that model. So there is something which I call the paradox of explainability, in that you first use this complicated black box model, then you generate or produce some approximation of this, which is not necessarily a simplification of this complicated model. But if that simplification would be good enough, you wouldn't need a black model in the first place. You would just say, the black models would be just used to guide the development of the simpler model, for which you know how to do, all the model risk management. So the challenge is that while we have some ways of creating some explanation about those models, they never will be 100% accurate. And furthermore, as AI systems adapt to data, one of the biggest selling points is that they adapt. You throw in a new training data into them, and those models adjust themselves. That means also that you need to think about monitoring your models, not only with respect to, say, accuracy or how accurate they are in detecting fraudulent transactions, but you also need to think about robustness. Are your explanations that you use for compliance purposes, are they robust as you use the new data? Are the fairness and transparency metrics that you use, are they stay robust? So many challenges. In financial crime, there is actually interesting way this is being done, because even though machine learning systems are being used, there is also the team that evaluates all the transactions that are being flagged by machine learning systems, and try to produce rules, explainable rules based on that. So there is that kind of level of explainability built in. But this is again a challenge and not fully resolved.
No, and a very complicated topic, and I'm sure we could spend a lot more time talking about it. Just before we move on to questions from the people that are dialed in today, Carson, I do have a quick question for you, just in terms of AI governance. Could you talk us through, just very high level, some of the best practices in your experience?
Yeah, so governance is a big thing, and it's important. I think one of the things to start with in the governance, and it's true for any development, is if you're going to use AI, especially deep learning that Lucas just mentioned, you need to define the project scope. There's a real danger if you go out of scope, or when you look at that scope, you've got to think, what's the value you're going to derive? Because sometimes the risk, especially of using deep learning models, sometimes the risk can be quite high. But so long as you're getting massive value, that's absolutely fine. But you've got to keep just a watch on that. So make sure that it's worthwhile doing this project. And in many cases it is, but that keeps you focused. Keep your eye on the prize, as they say. Next thing is, think about the ethical principles that are important to you. And they could be important because of regulation or because of your business. But think about what's important, what privacy do you need to ensure? What kind of accountability do you need in your system? What kind of transparency? Lukash talked there about explainability. What do you need? Look at accountability. Think about what are the roles and responsibilities of people within that pipeline. Yeah. How are you going to have oversight? Where's this checking? I think Janet and Lukash talked about, this regular testing and monitoring, and that's an important principle you should be using. Regularly test and monitor that it's doing what you thought it was, but you've got to have the oversight for that. You need to be able to report and have remediation. That's that contestability of the 5 principles that's really important. The next thing is Lukash said about how data is important in AI. So you better have good data governance. Assess the quality of the data, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you've got to make sure you've got good quality of the data, good protection, which bits of that data are sensitive. Make sure you protect that data in the right way, and make sure you understand who owns the data that's feeding the system and who's going to use it. Define all that at the beginning. Bring in stakeholders, use the best practice, and finally, continually test and monitor through development, but also deployment.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Carsten. So we'll move on to questions that have been raised through chat, and I think we've also received a few via email. So going back to the topic of synthetic data, we have a question. Synthetic data has the capacity to leak information about the data it was derived from. What measures have you explored to protect from this? Do you combine with PETs, pseudonymization?
So I think this question, and one from Gareth as well, came when I was speaking early on, and I think it was a really important question. So great question. Thanks for raising that. The one thing is these privacy enhancing technologies almost always have to be used in combination. So of course, the first thing you want to do is pseudonymize, because there is no reason not to. It can become challenging, I will say, if you've got data from 2 different sources. So let's say you've got 2 different banks and you've got some data, and what you want to do is pseudonymize, and you use separate schemes, right? So each bank pseudonymizes themselves. Your problem is there might be someone in one transaction sent that you've lost some information because you wanted it in the other. That's a risk approach. It's more private to say pseudonymize separately, but you've got to think how you pseudonymize. But definitely in all cases, there's no reason not to pseudonymize. Once you've done that, you've got to understand that there can be leaks, because what synthetic data does is it creates a data set that looks similar to the original one. Now, you've got to be careful about what you select, because that might be giving away some information. So that's why you might do some aggregation, one of the traditional PETs, where you say, right, I'm going to aggregate so that you can't be identified. You might do some other techniques, but what we do at the Alan Turing Institute is we test, and we've got a tool that's available publicly. I think it's on GitHub, called TAPAS, which gives us a way to check what is the information leakage from a synthetic data set. So in summary, what we do is we test to see if you're leaking other information. We use other techniques such as pseudonymization, something called differential privacy as well. These techniques are used to make sure that we are understanding and minimizing the risk of data disclosure.
Thank you. So, Carsten, I think you actually touched on this a little bit earlier, or at least shared your view. But I think for the rest of the panel, the question is, how do you see the balance between AI innovation and regulatory requirements evolving? Will regulation stifle or stimulate further innovation in AI? And I think, Carsten, you certainly shared the view it doesn't need to, but I'd be keen to get views from the rest of the panel.
I'm happy to dive in.
Yeah.
Like I said, it can certainly, if it's too harsh. I think regulators worldwide are seeing the benefits, because particularly in the financial space, we are up against some very well-funded and very well-motivated people who will be trying their own things and doing their own models. So we need to have some flexibility for innovation so that we've got a chance of keeping up with detecting what they're doing. That said, unlike the people that we're trying to detect, we have a duty of care to sort of the main customers of all of our clients, and making sure that we don't adversely impact marginalised people or do things that are unethical. So we have to work within guidelines. So it's finding that balance between making sure that we've got freedom to innovate, but then make sure that that's approved and has the right safeguards before it becomes live. And I think having that partnership between sort of like fully automated systems and systems where it's part of an existing process to improve efficiency is the way to take us forward. Because as soon as you have existing governance processes and the models become another data point in that process, it dramatically decreases the risk, because then you've got the time to investigate, look at other information, and make a decision based on expert knowledge, which is one of the things that we touched on earlier, that you can say, this is a thing, here are the transactions involved, here is what we found, and then let an expert human make that decision. That becomes a lot easier to justify, and the regulators are not happy with that, than something that's 100% automated that maybe you can't fully audit and explain. So there's definitely that mishmash of approaches, but I found from speaking to regulators, not only in the UK but abroad, that as long as you can have that good use case and you can explain what you're innovating, why you're doing it, and what those guardrails are, then they're generally happy for you to give it a go, and then they will sign it off.
Thank you, Janet. So there's a couple of questions just popped into the chat window. So how can AI help in the battle against money mules? Anyone want to pick that one up?
So I don't mind starting on that, Alan. One of the things is we've got to think, we've talked earlier about financial crimes, and there's a lot of different crimes, right? So money laundering is one thing that we see. In fact, in fraud, there's different types of fraud, which might be, an employee assisted fraud, and each of these has got different kinds of techniques. So when you're using looking at money mules, for example, what you're looking for is patterns within data. So rather than with transaction monitoring, you might be trying to say, is this fraudulent? Is this not? Is there something anomalous about this? But with money mules, what you're typically going to look for is there some kind of pattern that we're seeing? So for that, you're probably looking at more unsupervised than supervised machine learning. So supervised will give you a classification. Unsupervised will be much more about looking at the patterns in the data to say, look, I'm getting these cycles, this rapid movement of money. It could be in an account or not. So you can combine it with supervised learning, but most of the time in money mules, you're trying to spot where the money went through in the sense that we're looking at it. I'm sure Janet might have some other use cases as well.
And just to add to that, Carsten, on the topic of money mules, so yeah, absolutely right. It's to do with unsupervised learning and patterns. And I think recently I've seen a couple of use cases where on test data, one such technology was tested, and the results actually, in the context of money mules and a few other relevant typologies, the firm in question was able to detect quite a lot of what is called the unknown unknown. So money mules and networks that they did not know existed, that were going through their current rules-based systems. So I think the choice of technology, the mapping of the data to the technology, and the sort of calibration, I think can help you detect the unknown unknown that sort of drastically increases your risk coverage, protects the firm against sort of financial crime, which would have otherwise been completely gone unnoticed, so to say, until it sort of was picked up by a regulator or someone else.
Great, thank you, Munir. So I've got another question that's come in via email, which is, what can firms do in practical terms to stay ahead of changing AI regulations? Anyone would like to pick that one?
I think I touched on this a little bit in mind, that these regulations don't just drop out of the blue. You don't suddenly sort of come into work on a Monday morning and have to comply with a whole load of regulations. You get months, if not years, of notice of what's coming whilst they go through debate. So it's really important that you have someone within your organisation. I mean, it's all public information, so you can see what's coming up. Will it impact you? Do you need to change what you're doing? Does this suddenly mean that some of the models that you're running in one jurisdiction are no longer allowed? And then you can work out how that will impact you and your business. We went through the same thing with GDPR. You had like 2 years to get everything in place and all of the technology needed. It's the same with the EU AI Act, and it's the same with all of the other regulation worldwide. It's there, it's public. You just need to make sure that to protect your firm, you have someone or several people who are reading this and checking how it applies.
Absolutely. Munir, sorry.
I also think, Alan, in the domain of financial crime compliance, we currently don't have heavy regulation when it comes to the use of AI. I think largely what the industry has at this stage is in lines with what Janet said, which is a sort of steer from the regulators, which is, if you're using certain models, if you can demonstrate the benefit of using that over and above what you're currently using, and you are able to, based on what's possible in those models, provide the explanations that we need to understand and to sort of audit and inspect your financial crime sort of compliance defenses, then I think if firms can remain proactive along those lines within the FCC space, then I think we're in a good place.
Absolutely. So we have a few minutes left. I've got one final question here, which is, what are the most common pitfalls that firms encounter when trying to integrate AI solutions? And I think we touched on some of these points earlier. Anyone like to pick that up?
Is this where I say the D word again?
I know, we're going to say data. I think that's the takeaway from today. Data. Yeah.
I mean, for me, before I'll hand over, I can see others take a breath to say, but data, 100%. You can't run this on nothing. You've got to know, do you have the data that you need for the use case that you're trying to solve? And that might limit where you use things. If you don't have the right data available to you, it just might stop you from fulfilling a certain project, and then you've got to focus on something else. But then also have a clear use case. You can't just throw AI at it and magic happens. You've got to know what you're using it for in order to get, use the right models and therefore the right data, and be able to test it in the right way. So that, what do you want to do, and treat it as any other business problem, rather than thinking AI is a solution, I'll just apply it. It's, what is my business problem? What am I trying to solve? Is it making this process more precise, more efficient? Is it, making sure that my analysts can get through twice the number of cases in a week? That's your business problem. And then when you're looking at that problem, you can then look at the data and all of the tools available to you. And as we've touched on as a panel, there will be times when AI might not be the right answer, because you need that deterministic answer, or you need a simpler solution to solve that use case. So your use case first, and then data.
And I think that is it. Sorry.
I think just to add to that, I completely agree with that, Janet. But I think also around that, firm-specific approach and methodology to be able to calibrate these solutions based on your understanding of the data is quite critical as well, because otherwise these systems don't end up performing, and that causes a lot of grief.
Good. Well, I think this is probably a good point to wrap up the webinar after those words of wisdom. I'd like to thank our panelists for obviously sharing their experience and some really interesting insights. I hope all of you have found the webinar useful. Really appreciate you joining us today. We've had a good turnout, and I think it just highlights there's a real keen interest in AI, and I think there's a need to obviously better educate people around the regulations and what that means in practical terms. If anyone in the call would like to discuss some of the topics that we've covered today in further detail and how we might help you navigate some of the challenges, please do reach out. And lastly, the webinar recording will be available by the end of the week. We will send out a link. It will also be on the website, and we will also be publishing a white paper that touches on, I think, most of the topics we've covered on today's call. So thank you again, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good night.